The fourth and final persuasive theory I want to describe today is known as the narrative paradigm, or narrative theory. When we talk about narrative paradigm and narrative theory, there are a whole host of literary theories of narrative and various different theories that spin out from the narrative paradigm. And so in this brief lecture, I'll be just trying to encapsulate or otherwise overview some of the major worldview assumptions and key concepts that help explain or predict the principles associated with narrative theory. In doing so, I think it's important to note that the narrative paradigm really contains four assumptions. And the first is that the current expressions of good reasoning that we have are not just baked into things like math and science or otherwise coded forms of rationality and reason, but indeed oftentimes they come from traditional stories or otherwise passed down as social experiences, and those might not be part of our traditional argumentative structures, but they are a part of our traditional culture and society, and they are what help us make both central route processing decisions and peripheral decisions, to relate back to that previous theory we described as elaboration modeling. The second thing to note about the paradigm assumptions of the narrative worldview is that reasoning is often discovered in forms of symbolic action. Perhaps you can think about the way that patriotism is encoded in images of the flag in red, white, and blue as symbolic color references. Well, indeed, those symbolic elements are used in marketing and used in persuasion all over the country. Well, those forms of reasoning are surely symbolic and definitely working to kind of influence those peripheral routes of the elaboration likelihood model. So the narrative paradigm works in ways that argues that it's not always rationality, but also stories and culture which sometimes provide the good reasons that we accept. The third important narrative proposition to understand about the worldview or paradigm associated with narrative theory is that the stories that we share of history and culture and society, stories that build up through deliberation and conversation that we share with friends, family, and our communities, all work up to satisfy the demands of probability, how likely something is to occur again, and fidelity, how true or how resonant, how meaningful it is to us. And so in this sense, the final and fourth assumption that narrative theory makes is that all ethics are fundamentally narrative and all politics are structured through stories of culture that build over time. As a rhetorician, you can believe that narrative theory is the one that resonates most close with my heart, as we often focus on the way that arguments are, as I've often described, Legos that we stack and build to assemble deliberation which structures or scaffolds our society. So the narrative paradigm is truly a synthesis of two previous argumentative approaches. The first is the persuasive argumentative theme, which suggested that it was always about reasoned, claim, data, and warrant. And secondly was the literary or aesthetic theme, which looked at things like poetry and nonfiction and fiction, and described the way that those things were able to use characters and stories to otherwise more effectively influence and change attitudes and behaviors. And so as we think about what a paradigm means or how paradigms influence and inform our lives, it's important to think about how paradigms are interconnected sets of concepts or patterns. They include things like theories, but they also include things like research methods and various different standards for what constitutes something to be legitimate or as an actual contribution to a scientific, intellectual, or even social field of interest. Walter Fisher, one of the creators of narrative paradigm, juxtaposes the narrative paradigm with the rational world paradigm and suggests that there's this idea of claim, data, warrant, and then there's this idea that aesthetics and narrative and story and poetry and fiction can equally persuade and move us towards action. The rational world paradigm has a whole host of premises and presuppositions, including that humans are rational beings, that typically argument is what we use to make decisions, that arguments are ruled by a series of kind of like chess where we can define who's the winner and loser of an argument, that rationality is built up by things like who's the smartest and who knows the most about a subject, and that the world is ultimately a set of puzzles that can be resolved through reasoning. However, as we have transitioned into a postmodern era and a post-truth era even, we might challenge the postulates that are proposed by rational world paradigm believers. Instead, we might take up the narrative paradigm and recognize that the narrative paradigm acknowledges that society requires storytelling and that citizens share a common language that's often built through stories and traditions and experiences that they share one another together. In other words, if there's even going to be a public for argument to exist, there also has to be stories, traditions, and narratives that build those things. Rationality, in this sense, is often learned and built through the skills and stories of narrative. The narrative paradigm has its own presuppositions, including that the world is otherwise instructed to us through a set of stories and narratives, or master metaphors. Perhaps you've read something like the story of Odysseus, right? Or even Star Wars and the kind of intergalactic space cowboy story that is. Those large archetypal stories, or master metaphors, help set the plots of human experience. And indeed, if you've seen a show like Friends or The Big Bang Theory, you start to recognize certain archetypes and structures that fill in with not just sitcoms, but also a whole host of various different types of movie genres and other stories that we use to structure and tell the world around us. Narrative theorists believe that when we understand the world as a set of stories, it helps us understand all of these interconnections that subsume other arguments, or better help us explain the way that culture and politics or society and family all interrelate through these stories that have been shared. In this sense, the third important premise to note about narrative theory is that it presupposes that humans are what they call homo narrans, or otherwise storytelling animals. We live purely for the expression and experience of story. I'll link one of my favorite YouTube videos that I often play during this class and this lecture below, and hopefully you'll have an opportunity to check that video out as well, and perhaps even others by that performance poet Jason Silva that I'll share. The narrative paradigm really has 5 different beliefs. The first is that humans are naturally storytellers. We emerged as humans to tell stories and share from one another. Secondly, the good reasons we learn and understand come from the stories we've told and the genres they've built over time. Third, that how we evaluate good or bad stories is based on culture, history, and the various different ways that those stories have circulated throughout time. Fourth, in this sense, rationality is determined not by science, not by true or false, but by narrative beings who are aware of the probability and fidelity of the stories they share with others. And in this sense, fifth, the world is a set of stories that we share, and we choose which of those stories we want to believe, participate in, and pass along in order to define, describe, and otherwise live in the good life that we hope to share with others or persuade others to share with us. Narrative theorists often use 2 terms when describing their work. The first is narrative fidelity, and the second is narrative coherence. I'll begin with the second. When we talk about narrative coherence, we're talking about the degree to which a story makes sense structurally, or the degree to which it's organized in a way that includes sufficient details, reliable characters, and it acts in a way that's consistent with what you know from previous stories. Narrative coherence is something we tend to learn over time and through experience with various different stories and archetypes we come across throughout our life. Individuals can determine whether a story has narrative coherence by comparing it with the other stories that they've heard and by asking themselves whether it falls along predictable or reliable lines. The ultimate test of any narrative in terms of its coherence is whether or not the audience can count on its characters to act in a reliable or a consistent manner. Perhaps your friend is telling you a story set up to sound like the hero's journey, and in doing so the hero does something dishonorable or unethical. That might break the coherence of what you know to be the hero's journey and provoke some suspicion in the story, either that the story is not true or that your friend who's espousing the hero to be in a good moral or ethical position has some moral or ethical lapses of their own. The second important concept when discussing narrative theory is narrative fidelity. When we talk about narrative fidelity, we're talking about the extent to which that story speaks to your personal truth or resonates with your life experiences. So, a story has narrative fidelity when it can be seen as a guide for our own actions and belief systems. Perhaps you were raised knowing the story of the tortoise and the hare. Well, that story has a certain narrative fidelity. The story of the tortoise and the hare tells us that it's not always best to be the fastest or to be the most hurried, but sometimes that slow and steady does get the job done. And that sort of brief lesson, that fable encapsulated in that narrative, is what narrative fidelity is all about. It's the idea that sometimes we buy into the character's values or their logic, not necessarily for good, rational reasons, but because a story expresses them in a way that's convenient or effective and is otherwise more believable. We often decide whether stories have narrative fidelity, not just by sharing our own beliefs or affirming our own personal beliefs, but also by opening ourselves up to the experiences and stories of others and listening to their values and understanding the way their values might influence or resonate, associate with our own personal values in order to create social change. This is perhaps why narratives can be one of the strongest mechanisms to create social change, because the power of storytelling is often as influential as convincing and compelling rational argument.